very urgent. Your soulmate saying, I need to tell you the truth before I lose you forever. There are moments when silence becomes heavier than words. There are moments when a person can keep pretending that everything is fine, keep smiling, keep moving forward, keep telling themselves that tomorrow will be easier, until suddenly something inside them says, no more. You have to tell the truth. This message is written in that emotional, spiritual style, as a reflection on love, regret, honesty, timing, and the courage it takes to finally say what has been hidden in the heart. Something may have shifted last night. Perhaps it was a quiet moment when someone found themselves alone with their thoughts. Perhaps it was after a conversation, a memory, a familiar song, an old photograph, a message they almost sent, or simply the realization that time keeps moving whether the heart is ready or not, and in that quiet moment, the thought of you became impossible to ignore, not because you demanded an answer, not because you forced anything, but because sometimes the truth becomes louder when there is nobody left to distract us from it. They may have tried to convince themselves that distance was easier. They may have told themselves that silence was safer. They may have believed that if they waited long enough, the feelings would disappear. But what if they did not? What if the distance only made them understand what your presence once meant? What if every attempt to move forward kept bringing them back to the same unanswered question? What if I lose this person forever because I was too afraid to tell them the truth? That question can change everything. There is something powerful about realizing that you can survive without someone and still deeply wish you had handled things differently. There is something painful about remembering opportunities you allowed to pass. There is something humbling about admitting that pride, fear, confusion, timing, or circumstances influence decisions that your heart might have made differently. And perhaps this is why the energy surrounding this message feels so urgent, not because you should chase anyone, not because you should force a reunion, not because you should assume what another person is thinking, but because honesty has a way of finding its moment. The person connected to this message may have been carrying words they never knew how to say, words such as, I was scared. I didn't know what to do. I cared more than I showed. I thought I had more time. I didn't want to make things worse. I was afraid you wouldn't understand. I was afraid you would reject me. I didn't know how to explain myself. I regret staying silent. I should have told you sooner. And perhaps the deepest confession of all is this: I don't want fear to make the final decision for me anymore. Imagine someone sitting quietly late at night, replaying moments that seemed insignificant when they happened, a look, a conversation, a goodbye, a message, a missed opportunity, a moment when they wanted to say something but changed the subject, a moment when they almost reached out but decided to wait, a moment when they wanted to explain themselves but allowed silence to speak instead. At the time, perhaps each moment seemed small. But memories do not always remain small. Sometimes they grow in meaning. Sometimes distance gives old moments a completely different shape. Sometimes a person realizes that what they dismissed as ordinary was actually precious, and perhaps that is what happened last night. Something reminded them, something opened a door inside their memory, and suddenly, you were not simply a person from their past, you became a question they could no longer avoid. What happens if I never tell them? That question can be frightening, because there are certain truths that become more difficult to speak the longer they remain hidden. The longer someone waits, the more complicated the explanation becomes. The more time passes, the more they wonder whether they still have the right to return. They may wonder whether you have moved on. They may wonder whether you still care. They may wonder whether you would even listen. And underneath all those questions may be another one. Did I wait too long? That is where regret enters, but regret does not always mean that a person should return to the past. Sometimes regret teaches someone how to behave differently in the present. Sometimes regret reveals what mattered. Sometimes regret becomes the doorway to maturity. And sometimes the greatest truth is not "I need you." It is, "I finally understand what I should have said." Maybe they once believed that being vulnerable would make them weak. Maybe they thought showing emotion would give someone else power over them. Maybe they had been hurt before and built walls without realizing how high those walls had become. Maybe they were confused about what they wanted. Maybe life became complicated. Maybe responsibilities, distance, family expectations, personal struggles, misunderstandings, or timing made everything harder than either person expected. None of that automatically erases the hurt. None of it means you have to forget what happened. None of it means you owe anyone another opportunity. But understanding can sometimes exist beside boundaries. You can understand someone's fear without excusing their behavior. You can care about someone without chasing them. You can forgive without returning. You can leave the door open without standing at the doorway waiting. And that may be one of the most important lessons hidden inside this message. Love should not require you to abandon yourself. Real honesty should bring clarity, not confusion. Real connection should make room for respect. And if someone truly wants to tell you the truth, they must eventually take responsibility for speaking it clearly, not through hints, not through games, not through jealousy, not through manipulation, not through endless silence, through honest words. Maybe that is why this message feels like someone standing at the edge of a decision. They know that if they continue saying nothing, the story may eventually close without them ever explaining what was in their heart, and perhaps they are finally asking themselves whether temporary discomfort is better than permanent regret. There is a difference between fear and intuition. Fear says, "Don't say anything. You might get rejected." Courage says, "Tell the truth respectfully, even if you cannot control the answer." Fear says, "Wait for the perfect moment." Courage says, "Sometimes there is no perfect moment." Fear says, "Pretend you don't care." Courage says, "Care honestly, without demanding anything in return." And perhaps last night, courage finally became louder. Maybe the person connected to this message realized that pretending not to care was becoming more exhausting than admitting that they did. Maybe they realized that their silence had not protected them, it had only prolonged the uncertainty. They may have looked back at the relationship and recognized something they could not see clearly before. You were not asking for perfection, you were asking for truth. You were not asking them to have every answer, you were asking them to communicate. You were not asking them to predict the future, you were asking them to be present, and perhaps that realization hurts, because when someone finally understands what you needed, they may also understand how often they failed to provide. That is where an apology may begin, not the kind of apology that says, "I'm sorry you felt that way." A deeper apology sounds more like, "I understand now that my actions affected you. I understand that my silence created questions. I understand that you deserved clarity. I understand that I cannot rewrite the past. I can only be honest about it now." Maybe they are not ready to say those words yet. Maybe they are rehearsing them silently. Maybe they are typing and deleting messages. Maybe they are imagining different ways the conversation could go. Maybe they are wondering whether to begin with "I miss you, can we talk?" or simply "I need to tell you something." And perhaps the simplest sentence is the hardest, "I need to tell you the truth." Those words carry weight, because once the truth is spoken, there is no returning to the comfort of pretending. The truth may change things. It may bring two people closer. It may create closure. It may reveal misunderstandings. It may confirm that the timing was wrong. It may open a completely new chapter. But whatever happens, truth creates something silence cannot create: clarity. And clarity is powerful. You may have spent time wondering what certain actions meant. You may have questioned whether the connection was real. You may have wondered whether you imagined the significance of certain moments. You may have asked yourself why someone could appear so close and then become so distant. You may have wondered why they seemed to care and then behaved as though they did not. You may have asked why they never simply explained themselves. Those questions can become exhausting, and perhaps the person on the other side of the silence has been asking questions too. What if they think I never cared? What if they believe I moved on? What if they think I rejected them? What if they never knew what was really happening inside me? What if they have already closed the door? What if I am finally ready when they are no longer waiting? That final question may be the one that scares them most, because timing is one of the most mysterious parts of human relationships. Two people can care about each other and still fail to meet each other emotionally at the same moment. One person may be ready while the other is afraid. One may be speaking while the other is withdrawing. One may be reaching out while the other is protecting themselves. And sometimes both people care deeply but communicate poorly. That does not make the connection meaningless. It makes the situation human. But love cannot survive forever on what might have been. At some point, somebody has to speak. Somebody has to become honest. Somebody has to say, "This is what happened. This is how I felt. This is what I regret. This is what I hope. This is what I can offer now." And then the other person gets to decide what they want to do with that truth. That is important. Because this message is not telling you to wait indefinitely. It is not telling you that someone is guaranteed to return. It is not telling you that every coincidence is a supernatural sign. it is inviting you to consider the emotional possibility that people sometimes reach moments when they finally become ready to speak. If that moment comes, listen with discernment. Listen not only to words but to accountability. Listen not only to promises but to consistency. Listen not only to emotion but to respect, because anyone can say, "I miss you." It takes more courage to say, "I understand how I hurt you." Anyone can say, "I want another chance." It takes maturity to say, "I understand if you need time." Anyone can promise that things will change. It takes commitment to actually change behavior, and perhaps the truth this person needs to tell you is bigger than romance. Maybe it is about responsibility. Maybe it is about admitting that they were afraid. Maybe it is about acknowledging that they made choices they regret. Maybe it is about explaining something that you never understood. Maybe it is about finally removing the mask. There is something deeply moving about a person realizing that they no longer want to hide behind an image. They may have spent a long time trying to appear strong, unbothered, independent, detached, certain, but underneath that appearance, there may have been uncertainty. They may have cared deeply while acting casually. They may have missed you while pretending they were fine. They may have wondered about you while refusing to ask. They may have wanted to reach out while convincing themselves that silence was better. And perhaps last night, that strategy stopped working, because there comes a point when distraction cannot silence reflection. A person can surround themselves with people, stay busy, work, travel, laugh, scroll through endless distractions, start conversations, make plans, but when the room becomes quiet, the heart sometimes brings back the conversation that was never finished, and maybe your name belongs to that unfinished conversation. Maybe they realized that the hardest part was not losing contact. The hardest part was knowing they never gave the relationship the honesty it deserved. That realization can create a strange combination of emotions: regret, hope, fear, longing, embarrassment, courage, uncertainty. They may not know what happens next, and neither do you. That is okay. You do not have to know the ending to honor your own truth. You do not have to predict another person's behavior. You do not have to interpret every silence. You do not have to chase an answer. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is remain open to reality while remaining grounded in yourself. If someone wants to speak, let them speak. If someone wants to explain, let them explain. If someone wants to apologize, listen if you genuinely feel safe and ready. But remember that you are allowed to decide what happens afterward. Your heart is not a waiting room. Your life is not supposed to stop while another person decides what they want. You deserve relationships where communication is mutual. You deserve honesty. You deserve respect. You deserve peace, and perhaps that is why the strongest part of this message is not about someone else's confession. It is about your own awakening. You may be realizing that you no longer want vague affection. You no longer want confusing behavior. You no longer want to decode every action. You want something real enough to be spoken clearly, and maybe that shift inside you is exactly what makes this moment feel different, because when you stop chasing clarity, clarity sometimes has room to arrive. when you stop forcing an outcome, you can finally see reality as it is. When you stop trying to control another person's feelings, you reclaim control over your own life. And if they come forward, you can meet the conversation from a place of strength rather than desperation. Perhaps they will say, "I should have told you this a long time ago." And you may wonder why it took so long. They may say, "I was afraid." And you may understand, but still remember how their fear affected you. They may say, "I never stopped caring." And you may ask what that means in practical terms. They may say, "I want another chance." And you may decide whether their actions support those words. That is your choice. Never forget that. A spiritual message about love should not take away your ability to choose. It should strengthen it. If something is meant to grow, it should be able to survive honesty. If a connection is healthy, it should have room for boundaries. If someone truly values you, they should respect your decision even when it is not the answer they hoped for. And perhaps this person is learning that. Now, maybe they once thought love meant getting what they wanted. Now they may be discovering that love also means accepting another person's freedom. That is maturity. That is growth. That is what turns emotion into something deeper. Perhaps last night was not the beginning of a reunion. Perhaps it was the beginning of an internal realization. And sometimes internal realizations come before external actions. First someone admits the truth to themselves. Then they gather courage to say it aloud. Then they accept that the other person has a choice. Then they discover whether the connection can be rebuilt honestly. That process cannot be rushed. So if you feel a sense of urgency around this message, let the urgency be about truth rather than fantasy. Let it remind you that life is short enough to value honest communication. Let it remind you not to bury your own feelings forever. Let it remind you that apologies matter. Let it remind you that forgiveness can be powerful. And let it remind you that boundaries are also powerful. Maybe the person who needs to speak is not the only person carrying unsaid words. Perhaps you have your own truth. Maybe you never told them how deeply something affected you. Maybe you never told them what you needed. Maybe you never explained why you pulled away. Maybe you never admitted that you were hurt. Maybe you pretended you did not care because caring felt too vulnerable. Maybe you also built a wall. And perhaps the future, whatever it becomes, will require both people to stop hiding behind those walls. But there is no need to force that moment. Let honesty arrive naturally. Let actions reveal character. Let time show whether words become behavior. Because beautiful words can create hope, but consistent actions create trust, and trust is what any lasting relationship needs. There may be a reason this message feels emotional. It speaks to something many people experience, the fear of losing someone before saying what truly matters. We often assume there will always be another opportunity, another conversation, another weekend, another message, another chance, but life does not guarantee perfect timing. That is why honest communication matters, not because every feeling must become a relationship, not because every connection must last forever, but because people deserve to know the truth when it can be shared respectfully. Maybe your soulmate, or the person you feel deeply connected to, is realizing that now. Maybe they are looking at the distance between you and wondering how it became so large. Maybe they are remembering when things felt easier. Maybe they are remembering your laugh, your words, your patience, your presence, the way you listened, the way you made ordinary moments feel meaningful, and perhaps they are asking themselves whether they appreciated those things enough. Regret often begins with appreciation arriving late. A person may not realize the value of something while it is close. Distance changes perspective, silence creates contrast, and absence sometimes reveals what presence had been quietly providing all along. But if someone is experiencing that realization, let it belong to them. You do not have to carry their regret. You do not have to fix their fear. You do not have to rescue them from their consequences. They must take responsibility for their own journey, and perhaps that is precisely what they are beginning to do. Maybe they are becoming more honest with themselves. Maybe they are recognizing patterns they need to change. Maybe they are learning to communicate instead of withdrawing. Maybe they are learning that vulnerability is not weakness. Maybe they are discovering that pretending not to care does not protect the heart, it only delays the truth. There is a moment when the heart says, "I am tired of pretending." Maybe that moment came last night. Maybe something happened that made them realize how quickly circumstances can change. Maybe someone mentioned you. Maybe they saw something connected to you. Maybe an old memory surfaced unexpectedly. Maybe they encountered a place you once shared. Maybe they heard words that reminded them of your situation. Maybe there was no external event at all. Maybe they simply became quiet. Sometimes nothing dramatic happens outside, everything happens inside, and internal moments can be the most transformative. A person can wake up one morning knowing something they did not know the night before. They can suddenly understand their own behavior. They can recognize a pattern. They can realize that fear has been controlling their choices. They can decide to stop running from